There is a particular kind of grief that nobody warns you about. It does not arrive after a loss, not after a death or a betrayal, or the end of something you loved. It arrives quietly and without announcement on the day you wake up and realize you have been asleep. Not literally asleep. You have been going to work and coming home and making dinner and answering messages and laughing at things and nodding along to conversations. You have been present in every technical sense of the word. But something in you, something essential and watchful and alive, has been switched off for a long time. And the moment it flickers back on, the first thing it feels is not joy. It is grief. And nobody prepared you for that. You thought waking up would feel like liberation. You had read enough, perhaps, or listened to enough, or suffered enough to know that something needed to change. You sensed that you had been moving through your life in a kind of trance, doing what was expected, following the grooves worn into your existence by habit and obligation and the quiet pressure of everyone else's assumptions about who you are and what you should want. You were ready, you thought, to finally live deliberately. And then you stopped. You paused. You looked around. And what you found was not the luminous clarity you expected. What you found was sadness. Deep, unfamiliar, bewildering sadness. And your first instinct was to wonder whether you had done something wrong. You had not. But understanding why that sadness is not a malfunction, understanding what it actually is and what it is asking of you, requires a willingness to sit with something uncomfortable for a moment. It requires looking honestly at what autopilot actually was, what it cost you, and why the ending of it cannot possibly feel like relief. Not at first. Not honestly. Because what you are grieving when you stop living on autopilot is not just time. You are grieving a self, a version of you that no longer exists in quite the same way. And grief, even when it is entirely appropriate, even when it is the sign of something real and true and necessary, is still grief. If this is where you find yourself right now, if this strange and unmapped sadness has been following you around since you started paying attention to your own life, then I want to sit with you in it for a while, not to fix it, not to rush you through it to some sunnier place, but to help you see it clearly, because clarity, as I have come to understand, is the only kind of help that does not eventually betray you. Let us begin with what autopilot actually is, because the word is used so casually that its true nature tends to get obscured. We speak of living on autopilot as though it were a simple failure of attention, as though the solution were merely to pay more attention, to be more mindful, to notice the flowers and the light on the water and the warmth in your coffee cup. But autopilot is not simply inattention. It is something far more sophisticated than that. It is a system, a highly efficient, remarkably well-adapted system that the human mind develops in response to the demands of living in a world that is almost unbearably complex. Think of how many decisions you make in a single day. The psychologists estimate it is in the tens of thousands. If you had to consciously weigh every single one, you would never get out of bed. Autopilot is the mind's solution to this problem. It takes patterns that once required conscious attention and encodes them into automatic behavior, freeing up resources for what seems, to the system at least, to be more pressing concerns. The problem is that the system does not discriminate very carefully between the decisions that genuinely deserve this treatment and the decisions that do not. It will automate your choice of breakfast and also your relationship patterns. It will automate your morning commute and also the way you respond to criticism. It will automate the words you say to your children when you are distracted and also the career path you chose because everyone expected it of you. It does not know the difference between the trivial and the profound. It only knows efficiency. And here is what nobody talks about enough. The mind that runs on autopilot is not an empty mind. It is not a blank or passive mind. It is a mind that is fully occupied, constantly buzzing with thought and reaction and sensation, but occupied in a very particular way. It is occupied with the surface, with the management of appearances, with the performance of a self that has been assembled, piece by piece, from other people's expectations and inherited narratives, and the accumulated weight of every moment you have ever been rewarded for being a certain way and punished for being another. Hannah Arendt, the philosopher whose thinking I find myself returning to again and again, when I try to understand the human condition, wrote extensively about what she called thoughtlessness. And she did not mean it in the ordinary sense. She did not mean stupidity or carelessness. She meant something far more precise and far more troubling. She meant the condition of acting, speaking, living, without examining what one is doing, without pausing to ask what the action means, where it comes from, what it serves. She observed this in the most ordinary people doing the most terrible things, but she also understood that the same thoughtlessness operates at the level of ordinary life, in the small and relentless and compounded choices that make up a human existence. A life lived on autopilot is, in Arendt's terms, a life lived in thoughtlessness, not maliciously, not lazily, but in the absence of genuine reflection. And this matters because thoughtlessness, Arendt argued, is not neutral. It has consequences, not always dramatic consequences, not always visible ones, but the self that is never examined does not remain static. It drifts. It is shaped by forces it never chose to submit to. It becomes over time something that the person inhabiting it might not recognize, might not endorse, if only they stopped long enough to look. The day you stop living on autopilot is the day you stop. Just that. You stop and you look, and what you see is the accumulated drift of a self that has been shaped by everything except your own conscious participation. You see the years of doing what made sense, of following the path of least resistance, of being sensible and practical and appropriate. You see the friendships you maintained out of habit rather than genuine connection. You see the professional choices that were made for you by other people's ideas of success. You see the emotional patterns you repeat over and over, not because you chose them, but because they were the only patterns available to you at the age when you needed them most. You see the distance between the life you are living and any life you might genuinely call your own. And you feel sad, of course you do. This is not a malfunction. This is the most appropriate possible response to what you are seeing. I know that many of you watching this have been carrying this sadness alone, uncertain what to name it, wondering whether something is wrong with you for feeling it. You finally started paying attention. You finally started asking real questions about your life, and instead of feeling better, you feel worse. And that feels like a betrayal. Tell me in the comments how long you have been sitting with this particular sadness, the one that came not from loss, but from waking up. If the words feel too heavy right now, just type this: I see it now. Because the moment you name what you are seeing, something changes. Not dramatically, not immediately, but something. You stop being alone in the seeing. And someone else watching this, someone who has been too afraid to admit that waking up has been harder than they expected, they will see your words and feel less alone in it too. Your honesty is not just for you. It is a kind of gift to everyone still too frightened to speak. The philosopher Socrates, whom Arendt often returned to, famously said that the unexamined life is not worth living. He meant this as an invitation, a provocation, a challenge. But I want to suggest that the examined life has a price that Socrates perhaps underemphasized. The examined life hurts, at least at first, at least in the beginning, when the examination is new and you are seeing clearly for the first time. The examined life is characterized not by serenity, but by grief. Because you cannot begin to see your life honestly without also seeing what you have lost to thoughtlessness, what you gave away, what you let be taken, what you never quite managed to protect. Think of it this way. Imagine that you have been living in a house for years and you have arranged your furniture in a particular way, because it came arranged that way when you moved in and you never questioned it. One day you stop and you look at the arrangement with fresh eyes and you realize that not one piece of furniture is where you would have put it. The couch faces the wall, the table is too far from the window. The room you use least is the one with the best light. And it is not a tragedy, but it is a loss. All those years of sitting in the wrong chair. And the loss is more complicated than it first appears, because along with the loss is a kind of disorientation. If all of this was arranged by habit rather than choice, then what else in your life has been arranged the same way? The question, once it opens, does not close easily. If this perspective is opening something real for you, if you have been wondering why waking up felt like falling, consider subscribing. I explore these territories every week, and I would be honored to have you along for what is always an ongoing inquiry, rather than a set of finished answers. Let us talk about the specific texture of this sadness, because it is not uniform and it is not simple. There are, I think, several distinct strands woven through it, and they are worth separating because they each ask something slightly different of you. The first strand is regret. And regret is uncomfortable to name because we live in a culture that is deeply ambivalent about regret. We are told from a very early age that regret is unproductive, that we should have no regrets, that everything happens for a reason, and therefore there is nothing genuine to regret. But this is a lie, or at least a profound distortion, and pretending otherwise does not dissolve the regret. It only drives it underground, where it does its work invisibly. Regret is simply the honest recognition that things might have been otherwise, that the choices made in thoughtlessness, or the choices that were never genuinely made at all, but simply fell into place by default, had real costs. Years of pursuing the wrong things, relationships that were hollower than they needed to be, creative impulses that were suppressed because the time was never right, the conditions were never favorable, the self that wanted to make things was always being deferred to some more convenient future that never arrived. Genuine regret, looked at honestly rather than pushed away, is not wallowing. It is the mind's way of registering that what was lost mattered. And what mattered, mattered because you mattered. Because your particular way of seeing the world, your particular way of being human, had value that was not honored while you were living on autopilot. The regret, in other words, is a form of self-recognition. It says, I was worth more than this. I deserved a more deliberate life. That is not self-pity, that is accurate accounting. The second strand is disorientation. When you have been living by external scripts for long enough, the scripts become invisible. You forget that they are scripts. They feel like simply the way things are, the natural order, the unavoidable reality of what it means to be an adult, a partner, a parent, a professional, a citizen, a human being. When you stop and begin to question them, the effect is vertiginous. Because if these scripts were not inevitable, if they were chosen by you or for you or instead of you, then the question of what you would actually choose if you were really choosing is suddenly and urgently open. And that question is terrifying. Not because the answer is necessarily dark, but because the freedom it implies is enormous, and you have had very little practice with genuine freedom. Freedom is disorienting. We speak of it as the thing everyone wants, but the actual experience of genuine freedom, of the recognition that you could be otherwise than you are, that your life could be otherwise than it is not immediately comfortable. It is dizzying. Arendt had a concept she called natality, by which she meant the capacity for new beginnings that is fundamental to the human condition. Every human being, she argued, by virtue of being born, carries within them the capacity to initiate something new, to introduce something unprecedented into the world. But she also understood that this capacity is frightening. Beginnings require endings. They require the willingness to let what was be over, to step into the unmapped. And most of us, most of the time, are not ready for that. The autopilot is, among other things, a defense against the terror of genuine freedom. The third strand in this sadness is something harder to name. It is a kind of mourning for the self you thought you were. When you were living on autopilot, you had an identity. It may not have been a deeply considered identity. It may not have been fully yours. But it was stable, and it was legible to yourself and to others. You knew what you were. You had a role and a set of behaviors and a story about yourself that made sense, that held together, that gave you a place in the world. When you begin to live deliberately, when you begin to question the scripts and examine the assumptions and look honestly at what you have been doing and why, that identity becomes unstable. The story stops holding together quite as cleanly. You begin to see the seams, the places where the narrative was stitched together from other people's threads, and the self that was legible starts to become opaque even to you. This is sometimes called an identity crisis, but I think that phrase, with its clinical and somewhat dramatic connotations, misses the actual experience. It is less like a crisis and more like a slow dissolving, like a photograph left in sunlight too long. The image is still there, but it is fading at the edges, losing its contrast, its certainty. and you do not know yet what image will develop in its place. What I want you to understand is that this dissolving is not destruction. It is the necessary precondition for something more genuine. But the time between the dissolving and the emerging, that liminal space where the old self is no longer fully intact and the new one has not yet cohered, is genuinely difficult. And the sadness you feel in that space is appropriate. It is not a sign that you have made a mistake by waking up. It is a sign that you are taking it seriously. Now here is where I want to offer a reframing that I think is essential. We tend, in the discourse around awakening and consciousness and living deliberately, to position the before and after in a very particular way. Before is sleep, unconsciousness, loss. After is clarity, freedom, aliveness. And this is not wrong exactly, but it is incomplete in a way that sets people up for a kind of secondary suffering, the suffering of believing they are failing at waking up because they do not feel sufficiently liberated. The reframing I want to offer is this: the sadness that accompanies the end of autopilot is not the residue of the old life. It is not a symptom of the problem you are trying to solve. It is not evidence that you are not yet fully awake, or not yet fully healed, or not yet fully free. It is evidence that you are fully human. It is evidence that you are capable of genuine feeling in response to genuine seeing. And that capacity, the capacity for appropriate emotional response to what is actually true, is not the problem. It is the solution. It is what was missing when you were on autopilot. When you were running the automated programs, you were not actually feeling your life. You were feeling the simulation of a life, the performance of appropriate emotional responses at appropriate moments, but not the raw, unmediated, sometimes inconvenient truth of your actual inner experience. The sadness, strange as this may sound, is a sign of vitality. It means the system is coming online. Consider for a moment what it means to actually feel something. Not the performance of feeling, not the labeling of a state as sad or happy or excited or anxious for the purpose of communicating it to others, but the actual encounter with an emotion in its fullness before it is managed or categorized or narrativized into something more comfortable. This is rare. Most of us, by the time we reach adulthood, have developed formidable systems for managing our emotional experience before it fully arrives. We intellectualize, we deflect, we minimize, we catastrophize in order to perform a kind of mastery over what we actually fear might overwhelm us. We keep things moving so there is never quite enough stillness for something genuine to surface. When you stop living on autopilot, you stop moving in quite that way. And in the stillness, the actual emotional truth of your life begins to surface. And some of what surfaces is sadness, because a life partially unlived is genuinely sad, because time genuinely does not return, because the people you did not fully show yourself to, because the creative impulses you did not follow, because the choices you made by default rather than by genuine choosing, these are not trivial. They mattered. And the part of you that is now awake enough to see this is awake enough to feel it. There is a question worth sitting with here, and it is this: what would it mean to allow this sadness its full presence, not to wallow in it, not to build an identity around it, but simply to let it be what it is, to let it complete its movement through you rather than managing it into silence? Because here is what I have noticed, not just in my own experience, but in the experiences of everyone I have ever spoken with about this territory. When the sadness is not allowed, when it is suppressed or denied or hurried past, it does not disappear. It goes underground. And underground sadness becomes something else. It becomes numbness or bitterness, or a low-level anxiety that never quite resolves, or a restlessness that cannot be satisfied by any of the things you reach for to satisfy it. It becomes the very thing you were trying to avoid. Whereas sadness that is allowed, that is given space and respect and genuine attention, tends to move. It is not static. It has a direction. It goes somewhere. And where it tends to go, if you let it, is not deeper into suffering, but through and past suffering, to something that resembles clarity. Arendt understood the importance of what she called the vita contemplativa, the contemplative life, the life of thought and reflection. She did not oppose it to action, as it is often assumed. She understood them as interdependent, but she was very clear that genuine thought, the kind that leads to genuine understanding, requires a willingness to dwell in difficulty, to resist the rush to resolution, to tolerate the uncertainty and discomfort of a question that has not yet found its answer. Most of us are not trained to do this. We are trained to solve, to fix, to optimize, to move on. The capacity to simply be with something difficult without immediately trying to change it or explain it away is one of the rarest and most valuable capacities a human being can develop. The sadness that comes when you stop living on autopilot is asking you to develop this capacity. It is asking you to sit with what is true rather than reach for what is comfortable. And every time you resist the impulse to push it away, every time you allow it its full presence, you are developing a kind of inner muscle, a tolerance for reality, a willingness to be in honest relationship with your own experience. And that tolerance, that willingness, is the actual foundation of a deliberately lived life. Not the absence of difficult feeling, but the capacity to remain present with difficult feeling without being destroyed by it. Let me offer an image that I find useful. Think of a river that has been dammed. The water behind the dam does not disappear. It accumulates, it presses against the barrier, and the energy required to maintain the dam grows over time as the accumulated water grows. This is not a sustainable arrangement, but it is the arrangement that many of us live in. All the feeling that was never allowed, all the grief and frustration and longing and confusion that the autopilot efficiently redirected before it could surface is backed up behind the dam. And when you stop living on autopilot, when you remove the systems that have been managing this accumulation, the water begins to move again. And moving water is powerful. It can be frightening if you did not expect it. It can feel like flooding, but it is also life. It is motion. It is the river returning to being a river rather than a reservoir. The sadness you feel is the river beginning to move. The disorientation is the adjustment of your landscape to a new relationship with the water. Neither of these is a problem. They are the process itself. If what I am exploring here is touching something real in you, if you have been searching for a way to understand your own experience that does not reduce it to a pathology or a project to be fixed, I want to invite you to be part of this community. There are many of us exploring these questions together, not looking for easy answers, not looking for 10 steps or guaranteed outcomes, but genuinely trying to understand the experience of being human with greater honesty and depth. If you subscribe, you will get more explorations like this one every week, offered in the same spirit of honest inquiry, and I would be genuinely honored to have you along. This is not a channel about having figured it out. It is a channel about continuing to look. And if that is what you need right now, if you need companions who are willing to keep looking rather than people who will hand you a conclusion and send you on your way, then please subscribe. Hit the button, leave a comment if something landed for you, and know that your presence here matters to the shape of this ongoing conversation. Now let us move deeper into something that I think is essential to understand. The question of what happens after the sadness, or perhaps more accurately, what happens alongside it and eventually through it, because these things do not proceed in the neat, linear way we might prefer. One of the things that begins to happen when you stop living on autopilot and allow the sadness its appropriate space is that you start to encounter yourself more directly. Not the self that was assembled for the benefit of others. Not the self that was optimized for social legibility and professional advancement and the management of other people's perceptions. The self underneath all of that. The one that has preferences and aversions and ways of seeing the world that are genuinely its own. And the encounter with this self is frequently surprising, sometimes unsettling, and occasionally, in small and unmistakable ways, deeply moving. You find that you care about things you had forgotten you cared about. Not the things you were supposed to care about. Not the markers of success or the signals of status or the achievements that looked impressive on the surface of your life, but the small, specific, idiosyncratic things that animated you before you learned to perform yourself for other people. The way light falls through trees at a certain time of day, the particular pleasure of a certain kind of silence, the intellectual or creative territory that genuinely fascinates you not because it is useful, but because it is alive to you in a way that other things are not. The relationships in which you can actually be recognized rather than merely approved of. These rediscoveries are not dramatic. They do not arrive with fanfare, but they are significant in proportion to how long you have been without them. And there is, woven through them, a distinct quality of sadness, because to rediscover what you genuinely care about is to also encounter the full weight of how long it was absent from your life. It is something like finding an old letter that was never sent, full of words that were true but never spoken. But alongside the sadness, there is also something else, something quieter and more tentative but nonetheless real, a kind of orientation. For perhaps the first time in a long time, you have a sense, however faint, of what actually matters to you. Not what should matter, not what is supposed to matter according to the prevailing scripts of success and happiness and a life well lived, but what actually genuinely specifically matters to you, this particular person with this particular history, and these particular capacities, and this particular way of being in the world. Arendt wrote about action as the capacity to begin something new, to introduce a new thread into the web of human relationships and events, and she was careful to distinguish genuine action from mere behavior. Behavior is automatic. It follows from established patterns, social norms, habitual responses. Action, in Arendt's sense, is something different. It is the expression of who you are into the shared world. It is the showing of yourself, the disclosure of a particular way of being human that could not be predicted from the circumstances but must come from somewhere more essential. On autopilot, we behave. We rarely act in this deeper sense. We follow the patterns and meet the expectations and produce the outputs that are required. But we do not often introduce something genuinely new, something that could only have come from us. The sadness of stopping the autopilot is also a sadness for all the action you did not take, all the genuine expression that got managed into appropriate behavior before it could surface, all the times you had something real to offer and offered something safe instead, the times you had a genuine perception and converted it into a conventional one so it would be more palatable, the creative, relational, intellectual, existential contribution that was yours to make, and that remained unmade because the system was running on efficiency rather than on truth. But here is the thing about Arendt's concept of natality. It is not a concept about the past. It is a concept about the present and the future. Every human being, at every moment of their existence, carries within them the capacity to begin, not to undo what was not done, not to reverse the drift of years, but to introduce now in this moment something new, something that is genuinely yours. The capacity for new beginnings does not expire. It cannot be exhausted by years of not using it. It is, in Arendt's view, constitutive of what it means to be human. You were born with it. You will die with it. And in between, the question is only whether you use it. This is why the sadness, as real and appropriate as it is not the final word. It is not the destination. It is, as I said before, the beginning of a different relationship to your own existence, one in which you are a participant rather than a passenger, one in which what happens in your life is at least partly the consequence of genuine choosing rather than entirely the product of inertia and default. The sadness marks the ending of one way of being, and endings are genuinely sad. But endings that are genuinely felt, that are given the respect of honest grief rather than the avoidance of denial, tend to make real beginnings possible. There is something important to understand about the timing of this. We tend to think of waking up as an event, a moment of realization after which everything is different, and there are certainly moments that feel that way, moments of sudden and striking clarity that reorganize one's understanding of one's own life. But the actual process of stopping the autopilot, of beginning to live more deliberately, is not an event, it is a practice. And like any practice, it has rhythms of progress and regression. You will have periods of clarity and periods of confusion. You will make genuine choices and then notice that you have slipped back into automation without meaning to. You will encounter the sadness and sit with it well, and then you will encounter it again and manage it away badly and have to begin again. This is not failure. This is simply what the process looks like in the real life of a real human being. The perfectionism that wants waking up to be a clean before and after, a completed transformation rather than an ongoing practice, is itself a kind of autopilot. It is the automation of your expectations about your own development, and it tends to produce exactly the kind of secondary suffering I described earlier, the suffering of believing you are doing this wrong, that other people manage their awakenings more gracefully, that the sadness you feel is a symptom of insufficient progress rather than a sign of genuine engagement. Let me be as direct as I can about this. There is no person who has genuinely begun to examine their life who has not felt the sadness I am describing. There is no one who has stepped out of the trance of automatic living who has not had to grieve something. The grief is not the problem. The absence of grief would be the problem. The absence of grief would mean that nothing real had been encountered, nothing genuine was at stake. The examination was still only theoretical, still only an idea, rather than an actual lived engagement with the truth of your own existence. What you are doing in feeling this sadness is taking your own life seriously, perhaps for the first time, and that is not something to rush past or fix or resolve into something more comfortable. That is something to honor, because the alternative, the return to autopilot, is always available. It is always the path of least resistance. And the fact that you have not taken it, the fact that you are here asking these questions, sitting with this discomfort, looking honestly at what you see, means that something in you has decided that truth matters more than comfort. That is not nothing. That is in fact everything. Arendt spoke of what she called the life of the mind as something that requires courage, not physical courage, something more subtle and perhaps more difficult. The courage to think without a predetermined conclusion, the courage to follow an inquiry wherever it leads, rather than only to the places you already know, the courage to be uncertain, to be in question, to admit that you do not fully understand your own experience or your own motivations or what your life is actually for. This is the courage that waking up requires, and it is a courage that, unlike most kinds, cannot be summoned in a single dramatic moment. It has to be renewed quietly and without ceremony, every single day. Every day you choose again to pay attention rather than to run the program. Every day you allow yourself to feel what you actually feel, rather than the feeling you have been authorized to feel. Every day you ask what you are actually doing and why, rather than simply continuing because the momentum of yesterday is sufficient to carry you forward. These choices do not feel heroic. They rarely feel significant in the moment, but accumulated over time, they constitute an entirely different way of inhabiting your existence. They constitute a life that is, in the deepest sense, being lived rather than being had happened to you. The sadness does not go away entirely. I want to be honest about that because I think the promise of its complete dissolution is one of the ways spiritual and philosophical discourse misleads people. The sadness does not go away because the things that were lost to thoughtlessness were real losses, and the recognition of real loss is not something that resolves into indifference. What changes is your relationship to the sadness. It becomes less overwhelming, less confusing, less frightening. It becomes in time a companion you recognize rather than an intruder you cannot understand. It tells you things. It points toward what matters. It keeps you honest when the pull toward comfort would have you abandon an examination before it is complete. And alongside the sadness, other things begin to grow. A kind of aliveness that was not present before. Not the performed aliveness of someone trying to seem engaged, not the performed gratitude of someone working through a wellness practice, but the genuine, specific, sometimes inconvenient aliveness of a person who is actually in their own life rather than watching it from a slight remove. Small pleasures become more genuinely pleasurable because you are actually there to receive them. Connections with other people become more genuinely connective because you are no longer performing connection, but attempting it in earnest. Your own thinking becomes more genuinely interesting to you because it is no longer the recycling of other people's conclusions, but the actual movement of a mind engaging with what it does not yet understand. This is what was on the other side of the sadness, not the absence of sadness, not the transcendence of difficulty, but the presence of genuine experience in a life that is genuinely being lived, and the distinction between that and the alternative, between a life that is genuinely being lived and one that is being had happen to you by the accumulated momentum of unexamined choices, is the distinction that makes all the difference. Come back to where we began, to that moment of waking up and finding grief where you expected freedom. You understand it differently now, I hope. The grief was not the sign that something had gone wrong. It was the sign that something was going right. It was the evidence that you were looking honestly at your own life, rather than at the comfortable story about your life that the autopilot had been narrating. It was the necessary passage between what was and what could be, not a passage you rush through or manage or transcend, but one you walk deliberately, with whatever patience and honesty and self-compassion you can muster. The sadness that begins the day you stop living on autopilot is not a punishment, and it is not a malfunction. It is the first honest feeling of a life that has decided to begin. And beginnings, Arendt understood, are the most genuinely human thing there is. They are what we are for. The capacity to start again, even from this particular place, even with this particular history, even with all the years of drift and default that brought you here, is not diminished by any of that. It is intact. It is waiting. It has always been waiting. The question is only whether you will show up to meet it. Not perfectly, not with everything figured out, not on the other side of the grief where it is all clear and clean and resolved, but here, exactly here, in the middle of the honest difficulty of a life that has decided to be examined rather than simply endured. That is the beginning. That is, in fact, the only beginning there ever is.